Thanks. Welcome everybody for this, which is the second last session for this year of this academic year for radical anthropology. And we are venturing to the Neolithic with some more archaeoastronomy tonight with John Cox, who's been regularly attending the radical anthropology lectures and is well versed in our kind of archaeoastronomy background, especially Lionel Sims' work. And John is going to be talking about his work on the prehistoric temples of Malta and Gozo. So please, John, take it away.
Okay. Right. Well, the reason I first came along to radical anthropology was because I met Lionel Sims at a couple of conferences, and he was quite interested in the moon, and of course I was working on the moon, so we had that affinity. And something he said to me, which I'll try and get to, was look at the minor standstill. Well, I think we might get to the minor standstill by the end of the evening, but let's begin with one or two basics. Okay, I think everyone will be familiar with the idea that the sun rises north of east in the summer, and it rises south of east in the winter. And here in London, latitude 52, the overall spread is quite a lot. The overall spread is about 90 degrees. June 21st, 45 degrees north. December 21st, 45 degrees south. So that whole difference between the most northerly rising point and the most southerly rising point is what you might call the amplitude of range in the azimuth of sunrise over the course of a year. Okay. Now the other effect that you might be familiar with is the idea of the solstice. Now at the moment we're approaching the summer solstice. So the sun has been rising further and further north until around June the 21st, it stops. It starts rising from very much the same position. In fact, for about 3 weeks, 4 weeks, you really can't tell the difference. Small differences in atmospheric refraction mean sometimes it rises a little bit farther north or a little bit farther south. And that's really down to whether it's been a hot day or a cold day or what have you. So this is called the solstice, that's the standstill. And the solstice isn't just one day. The solstice is a whole period. The solstice is 2 or 3 weeks. How picky do you want to be? I say it lasts about a month. I say we're virtually into it now. It's June the 5th. I don't think you're going to be able to tell any difference in the length of a day from now for the next month. So we are already in the standstill. Now something similar applies to the moon. The moon rises north of east at one point in the month, and it moves south, and then it rises well south of east at another point. And the difference between the most northerly point and the most southerly point is half of a tropic month. It's only a tropic month is 27.3 days, so that's 13 days. So it takes 13 days to get from its most northerly rising point to its most southerly rising point. But the overall amplitude of that range changes. It changes in an 18.61 year cycle. It's normally called the 18.6 year cycle, rather clumsy, but there we are, the 18.6 year cycle. And at the moment, we're approaching the maximum of the cycle. So at its most southern, most rising point, the moon is rising well south of the sunrise, and its most northerly rising point, which is just half of 27 days, just 13 and a half days later, is rising well north. Okay, now the period from north to south and back again is 27 and a half days. And that is 2 days shorter than a full month full moon to full moon. So each time it gets to the most southern rising point, it's 2 days younger than it was the time before. We'll see, that matters, that comes to matter. Okay, now a bit like the sun, it reaches a most southerly rising point, and it rises from very much the same position, certainly for 2 days, maybe even for 3 days. There's a slight difference, but it's not much. And the same is true at the northern end. Okay, so the moon shows a little standstill once a month at its most southerly rising point, and it also shows a standstill at its most northerly rising point. We're going to concentrate on the southerly one. The next thing is this amplitude. The amplitude gets bigger for 9 years, and then it comes to a maximum. And again, it returns to the most southerly rising point for a couple of years. It depends how finely you want to tune this. Really, maybe 3 years. I think we're going to find out it's usually about 3 years, give or take. So that's also a standstill. And that's what's normally called the lunar standstill. Okay, so now what we're looking at is some prehistoric sites in Malta. And there are quite a number of them. Mostly they're terribly ruinous. This is a map of the 30 or so identified so-called temple sites. And they're called temple sites because the first one to be uncovered, and this was uncovered, I think in 1790, is this one, Gigantija. I think that just translates as the giant, or the giant woman, in fact, because it's a feminine form. So this is the giant woman. Or maybe it was built by a giant woman. That's another story about it. This is huge. Running up the middle is a central aisle, so to speak, a central axis. And the cells either side. There are paired chambers either side. Symmetrical, mirroring patterns, very similar to the sort of thing you get in a church. You get a central aisle and you get sort of little side chapels, and very often the chapels face each other. So this is perhaps one reason why it's called a temple. The other reason why it's called a temple is because it was uncovered in 1790 in the period of the picturesque tour. So anything like this was either it was going to be a palace or it was going to be a temple. So 1790, it was a temple. This is one temple we're looking at in particular. And here's the rear wall. You can get the scale of this thing. This thing is gigantic. And what's quite interesting here is you see the way it's constructed. You see there's a what's called a header, and there's a stretcher, and there's a header, and there's a stretcher, and then there's a header. Now that's exactly the same as a brick wall is constructed. This is freestanding building. And the date of its construction is about 3,500, maybe 3,600 BCE. In fact, this might be the very first freestanding building, freestanding stone building in Europe for sure, maybe the world, who knows. This is the second one of these temples. This one is also pretty gigantic. It's made of a very soft limestone. In this case, the other one wasn't. The other one had a carapace of very hard limestone. This one's a soft limestone, and it's got seriously eroded. The front was reconstructed. It was reconstructed in the 1950s. So one has to be a little bit careful. You can never be quite sure what you have now is what was there originally. But down the central aisle, you've got a line of flags. So that very probably is absolutely original. And so we're quite interested in the line of the central aisle, the central axis, as it's called. The third one I'm looking at is this one, which is Courtyard, which is much, much smaller. But as you can see, it's still got a pretty megalithic front. It's got this rather nice dish front. It's got a line of steps. It's got this extraordinary lintel, which may or may not have been the original lintel. I think it may have been. There's a reconstruction story which I think is about 1930, 1920. But I'm assuming, I think we can assume they got it right. Okay, now of the sites that we saw earlier, the 30 so sites, most are pretty derelict ruins. Some have been deliberately ruined. A couple of, one at least has been lost because they built an airport over the top of it. So that one's gone entirely. There are about 17 where you have a central apse with mirroring units either side. Maybe and this is looking at the alignment down the central axis. And when you do this, what you discover is there's this quite interesting bunch around here. And there's three here: Gigantesia, which is the first one we looked at; Argeim, which is the second one we looked at; Courtyard, which is the third one we looked at. These have all got very similar bearings. They all face in a very similar way. So an early paper here, I think 1992, posed the question, were these temples, particularly this group here, and maybe this group in particular, but were this group here aligned on some astronomical marker? Because as we saw, one's in one island, one's at one end of the other island, and the other one is at the other end of the other island. So they're all widely separated in space. How come they're all facing the same way? So that was the question. And the 1992 paper came up with two ideas. One was that they might be aligned on the moon, and the other was that they might be aligned on the stars in the Southern Cross and Centaurus. The 1992 paper, I'm sorry, the 1992 paper didn't like the moon hypothesis because, as it said, it could only really be applied to two temples. It didn't actually go on to say which two it was, but the two, reading between the lines, were Courtyard and Gigantesia. We'll see why in a bit. So here's one, Gigantesia. That's the huge one. Argeim, this is also pretty big down here. And the third one here, Tajarat. Very nice spread. Is there any sort of material evidence of an interest in stars? Not much. There is this particular little limestone shard. It's got a moon on it. It's got some stars on it. And it's got these strange radial lines. Okay. That's really the only, perhaps the only indication in material remains. And there's not a lot of material remains, artifact remains from the temples. Okay, now we're looking at the star group, which Serio, Hoskin, and Ventura thought might have been used to orientate the southeast facing temples. At the top here is a red giant star, star crux, and that's going to be actually red to the naked eye. You look at that, you're going to see the color. People are always a bit surprised by the idea that stars are colored, but the red, bright red stars are very easy to see colored. There's about a dozen you can see colored, and Garg one of them. Here, I've got them labeled. Here's Rigel Kent. Here's Haydard. These two turn up on the Australian flag. And here's the Southern Cross, which is normally there and there. Now, whether prehistoric man saw the cross as the Southern Cross, who knows? Maybe they saw it as a triangular sort of lozenge, a diamond shape. Or maybe they didn't see them as a star group at all. Maybe they just saw the individual stars. Anyway, this is the grouping. Now, move that out of the way. Close that. Pick up this one. Okay. In the period 2005 to 2007, I and a group of people visited each of the three temples on a number of occasions in order to photograph, or to observe and to photograph the moonrise. Because for whatever reason, I thought the moon hypothesis was rather a good one, and I wanted to test it with practical observations. So my approach here is just, let's do it. Let's see how it works. Is it real? And I think the answer is yes. If I can move that across. Okay. So that was the first observation. That was made from Gigantesia, which is that the big one in Gozo. And that was done in May 2005. Now this is a year short of the maximum of the temple, the maximum of the lunar cycle. And we can see already the moon is rising pretty well down in line with the main axis of the temple. So came back in the spring of next year. This was taken in January. This is a shot by Mark Genby took this one. It's very difficult to see the moon low down. Any kind of cloud blots it out. I've never been able to observe a last crescent in this case. It's a last crescent rising at the level of the horizon. You always pick it up when it's a degree or two risen. So that's January. And that's an observation from Gigantea. Okay, now this is an observation made in February from another of the temples. It's from Argeim. And We're not very good at night photography at this stage, so it's not a very clear picture. I've worked it up a little bit, but there's the moon there. So it's well to the left of the frame. This is Argentine. This is from Gigantea in March. So you can say the moon now has gained a bit. So it's a bit bigger. And again, it's rising, probably rising about there, pretty much in line with the main axis of the temple. And this is the same shot, I'm not sure it's the same night or not. Let's go back. Yes, it's the same night. So another one of the ideas was to have somebody in one temple and somebody in another temple, and they were both photographed the same moonrise. And then we could compare the view from the two temples. So this is the first try from Courtyard, and again, there's an elevated horizon at Courtyard, but we can see it's rising pretty much in line with the main axis of the temple. Back in Courtyard next month, 4th, it's April. So the moon is a bit fuller now, it's last quarter. That's 2006, okay. Oh, right, okay, that's the next night. So we've got a shot here, this is one night, and then this is the night afterwards, and we can see it's moved along a little bit. Not a lot, but a bit. So essentially speaking, you get 2 or maybe even 3 shots at a southerly moonrise. One's slightly more southerly than the others. In this case, that one's more southerly. That one's come north a little bit the next day because it's moving back. This is May. Actually here, it's rising just a little bit to the right. There's a line of houses here. Maybe the original horizon was this kind of escarpment here. And we got a bunch. I visited these houses afterwards. They're 3 stories, some of them. And this is Argentine. Let me see. So that's 15th of May. So that's 15th of May. So this is one of the cases when we've got an observation from one temple and an observation from the other temple. So now we can compare the 2 temples, assuming our observation point is right. And I've tried to standardize the observation point. I'll just cover that in a minute or 2. But so here we can see in Gigantea, it's rising a little bit right to the right of the frame. Same moonrise observed from Argentine, and it's well to the left, and the rising point is down here. It's very difficult to see the rising point, in fact, because there's a wall here, a line of trees, and then very strangely, there's something called the southern building here. Now, restoring, trying to work out what the original landscape was like is quite tricky, but there might have been just a little glimpse of a sea horizon. On the other hand, the southern building is getting in the way. So we can assume the rising point is about here, and it's coming up on this line. So it's pretty much left of field in Argentine. Let me see, let's compare. So, okay, second night. So that's a night later. Again, it's May. And here, this is one of the occasions when the moon rises at much the same point. One night, it's approaching the maximum point south, but we didn't quite get it. We saw it just before it got there. But the next night, it's coming away from the maximum point south. So it's exhibiting a little standstill. A little standstill is about, quarter of a degree, something like that. The moon itself, of course, is diameter half a degree. So the next thing to consider is that in the prehistoric period, the tilt of the Earth was slightly different, and the moon would have risen about one diameter further south than it is rising now. So what we're trying to do is, by making practical observations now, we're trying to work out what it would have looked like in period. Whether this, let me just check, is that the same night? Yep, same night. Gigantisha. Okay, rising point slightly to the right of the frame. Well, central to slightly right. Difficult to see. Here's the edge, here's the other edge. It's about in the middle, I think. So the rising point's about here. So maybe pretty much smack middle. Courtyard. Okay, now that was the first year. So I think what we saw here also was the fact that what you get is you get a series of moonrises. And the strange thing is it's running backwards through the phases. The first one was the last crescent. 2 months later, it's the last quarter. May, June, it's a full moon. You can't get the one in July, August, and so on, not on the horizon, because the moon it looks bright at night, but it's not very bright really compared to something like the sun. And if the sun's up, there's too much light in the atmosphere for you to make out the shape of the moon when it's very low down. You can't actually see it. If the sun is still above the horizon, you can't see it. You can't see a moonrise at the level of the horizon. So this is just a spring. It just happens in the spring. You get the moonrise at the southerly rising point, January, February, March, April, May, June, and that's it. July, of course it does rise, but now it's rising in daylight. You see it maybe when it's risen a few degrees, but you don't see it at the level of the horizon. So now we're in our third year of observations. This is now 2007. We're getting better at taking the photographs. The photographs are getting, they're improving. So this is March. A little bit left, but you can actually see the rest of the moon here at a diameter. And that's the position in the prehistoric period. This is one from Argeim. Now, as we can see, Argeim is the point of moonrise is left of the frame. But actually, it's really rather nice once it's risen a bit. It's straight down the middle. We've got wooden boards here. Imagine if they were, if the original flags were exposed. Put some water down them, and you would have got a glitter path. So there's a lot of room for theatric displays from inside the temple. Okay, so the year 2007, we're just tidying up. And occasionally having a bit of fun. This is an observation from the back of Argeim. Now, because Argeim is made of this very soft limestone, and because the rain now is very acidic, it's been eating away at the structure like nobody's business. And now it's being tented. They put a tent over the top to protect it. So this is not a particular brilliant photograph, but it's not bad. There's one of Michael Spiteri's photograph. That's Jupiter. This is Scorpius. Not much color there, slight bit of color. That's Antares. And there's the main apse. We're a bit off center because there are these supplementary temples to this one. It's a very complicated structure, but I think it's quite a fun shot. But just slip that in. One of the problems with observing from Argene was the fact that there was a restaurant with some lights on, this wall, this bunch of trees, and here's the southern building. So again, we can see how a far southerly moonrise only just escapes. In fact, now it probably doesn't escape. If we could see right the way down to the true horizon, it probably doesn't escape the southern building. But I think in period, because it rose one diameter further south, it would have just squeezed out. This is quite an interesting feature. That's just a shot. Hey, rather nice. Say hello to the moon. You're sitting in the temple, you're waiting for the moon. Is the moon going to appear? And then it appears. To some extent, this moves you into the sort of frame of the inhabitants of these temples. The moon is a visitor. You're privileged to have her on board. Right, this is 2007. So now, this is now 2 years after the original shot. Perhaps the position of the moonrise is beginning to move a little bit left. But I think what this series of observations did demonstrate was that for 2 or possibly 3 years, you consistently got a moonrise, certainly down the center of Gigantija temple, once and sometimes twice a night. So this wasn't just a single one-off observation. The number of possible observations is, well, 6 times 2, that's 12, times 3, that's 36. You might get 36 shots at seeing it. One of the objections to the moonrise theory was that this was rather a rare event. Well, here we've demonstrated that it's not a rare event. It has a pulse. It's coming in an 18.6, coming in a 19-year pulse. It hits the maximum. It's there for a couple of years, 3 years maybe. That's the standstill. And then it moves gradually out of frame. There we are. So that's the rise. And here's the sequence. Midwinter, don't see it. First month, last crescent. Next month, bit more of it. Spring, last quarter. Waning gibbous, midsummer, full moon. So there's a magical trick here, which Lionel was very keen on. The moon is running backwards. Normally when you see the moon rise, each night, there's a little bit less of it. But when you start picking out this particular observation, suddenly you've reversed time. It's quite magical, really. And the moon is quite good like that. You can run lots of things in reverse with the moon. And this is one of the ways in which the moon runs Widdershins. It runs things backwards. Okay, let's shut that one down. Context, bit of context. Just so you know where Gozo and Malta are. They're in the Mediterranean. They're about 50 miles south of Sicily. You can't actually see them. You might be able to see them from Mount Etna, but otherwise speaking, they're out of sight of land. And Gozo and Malta were uninhabited until about 5000 BC. Normally, first occupation is put at 5200. It's thought some people came across from Sicily, and they might have brought a full Neolithic kit with them, or at some stage early. That's to say, they brought barley, they brought emmer, they brought lentils, they might have brought goats. It's really quite science fiction, really, moving on to another planet, these uninhabited islands, first occupied. And for about 1,000 years, that first settlement seemed to have just got on with it. Nobody might have visited. They might have had a little bit of contact with Sicily. They had obsidian, which they didn't have on the island. They had a bit of flint, which they didn't have on the island. They have chert, which is kind of flintish, but it's not so hard as flint. No metal, of course, because we're in the Neolithic. At this point here, so-called Zibug period, I'm not sure whether I'm pronouncing it that correctly, there's some sort of change. These periods are named after pottery styles. We've got a grey clay here, and then at this period here, it was suddenly changed to a red style, but it's much the same pottery style. And at this point here, 4000 BC, there's some sort of change in style. Suddenly we got ochre painted pottery. So maybe there was a second group arrived, or maybe there's some renewed contact with the outside world, because essentially speaking, there won't have been much contact. There's very little exotic material discovered from this period. And certainly true now, the prevailing winds, the prevailing currents carry you from Sicily down to Malta and Gozo quite easily. But those same prevailing conditions make it really rather difficult to get away. Well, we don't know about navigation in the period, but maybe the boats weren't that advanced. So getting there would be fairly easy. Getting away was tricky. So there was clearly a bit of trade with Sicily, but not a lot, as I understand it from reading the standard accounts. Temple building begins here, and it's named after Gigantisha, which is that huge one that we saw, and that's normally dated at about 3600. So now temple building comes in two phases. There's a Gigantisha phase, and then there's a late stage called the Takshin phase. And then at the end of the Takshin, about 2500, that was it. The temples were abandoned. Not quite abandoned, perhaps, because another group, seemingly with very different habits, took over in Takshin temple itself. But essentially speaking, there was a period of temple building. It went on from here, from 3600, and the temples then were continually used for 1,000 years. More temples were added in this period here, and then the whole thing stopped. It's a bit of a mystery. This is dated to about 3800. Okay, collected burial. The dead were buried in underground in caves to begin with. Well, always, in fact. And at about 3800, the people got quite good at cutting them out. So here's a standard, here's an underground mortuary and bone store, if you like, chamber 2. The rock's quite soft, so what do? You begin by cutting a central chamber, and then you cut a supplementary cell and you leave a bit of the wall standing to hold the roof up. If you don't do that, the roof might collapse. So we've got a central chamber here, and then we've got a little cell cut out, and then another one cut out, and then another one, and we've got an intervening wall. So when we look at a 3 apse type temple like Courtyard, we've got the same format. We've got a central chamber here, which is flagged, and then we've got a supplementary chamber here, a supplementary one, a supplementary one here. And this is very like an underground burial chamber, except now it's been constructed above ground. Now, there was stone walled building to some height or other, right the way through and preceding the temple building period. But the feature about the temples is you suddenly get a complex of cells in a single unified structure. And again, you can see little traces of stretcher, header, perhaps not so much in this one. And in the middle, you've got a kind of courtyard. Now, was this courtyard roofed or was it open to the sky? Well, opinion is divided. My part, I'm inclined to think that most of this was open because you've got these little structures here. It's much easier to roof each one individually. And then if this central section here is free, you can get at the roof. And you're going to maintain these things for 1,000 years. You want to be able to get on the roof to keep the thing going. And also in some of the bigger ones, you have fires. Maybe this is a fire pit, maybe this is a fire pit. So unless you've got a central area to let the smoke out, it's going to be rather ghastly inside. Here you can see the head of structure around the edge of Gigantesia. And the thing you notice here is there's a pair of temples. There's 2 of them. Here's the big one, and here, so to speak, is the daughter. Now it's thought this one here, Gigantesia, was the main temple, was the earlier one, and this one is a little bit later. It's a slightly different format, and it's facing in a slightly different direction. Now, for the observations, we were just interested in the main temple, so to speak, the big one. And we tried to choose a simple position to take photographs from, which was easy to find, easy to return to, and had some sort of ceremonial feeling. You invite somebody into your house, you might receive them in the hall. In here is the inner zone. So here's the point at which you receive them. So when you're inviting the moon into the temple, this, so to speak, is where you stand to greet her. The vertical orthostats here. There's a terrific threshold, beautiful stone here. And we take a central position at the waist of the building. And the same is here for the observations from Archim, same thing. Again, we've got this pair of orthostats at the waist of the building, so we can reproduce the same observation position in this temple as well. And indeed, the same observation position in Courtyard. So this has 2 effects. It standardizes, so to speak, the point of observation, so you can compare one temple with the other. And the other thing is it's quite an easy position to find in the dark. You've got the two orthostats, you can just measure off the center and you know where to put your camera. So upshot is, you can then start You've got a standard position in each of the three temples, and you can start comparing how things look. So this is from Gigantea, three different observations made from Gigantea, and you can see Gigantea is slightly right of center, slightly left of center. So Gigantea, for whatever reason, is on target for a far southerly moonrise. Courtyard isn't. Sorry, I'm getting no. Sorry, no. We're in Argime now. Argime is well off center. It's at least 2 or 3 degrees away from this central position. Courtyard, not bad. Add a diameter to give us the prehistoric period. Pretty central, maybe very slightly left of center. Maybe pretty much smack on. Okay, halfway through the temple building period, there was some sort of change. There's the most extraordinary structure. There's a series of natural caves, and these have been opened up, and they get better and better opening up. And suddenly, at about 3,800, no, 3,200, so it's estimated, you get this extraordinary mimicking of the surface style in the underground burial chamber and ossuary. This is this is the middle level of a whole collection of rooms constructed underground. This one's about 5 meters underground. It's estimated that this complex, which was in use for the whole temple period, maybe starting even before temple building, reaching this extraordinary peak at about 3,200, it's thought that this complex contained the bones of about, so it was estimated, 7,000 individuals, which were shuffled around. We're not quite sure how it worked in this one, unfortunately, because it was cleared, I think, in 1902. And for whatever reason, the clearance record was lost. So the locations can be guessed at and have been fairly well worked out, but we're not quite certain what was where, which spaces were kept empty, and which ones had bones stored. Now, there was some sort of process of resorting. There's another one of these underground hypogea discovered in Gozo, and that was excavated, well, fairly roughly at one point. Bits fell in, and then it was the bits which hadn't yet fallen in, or the bits that had been fallen in and were safely covered, were then uncovered, I think, in an excavation. I'm not quite sure the date of it, but maybe it was about 1990. And so a lot of what one knows about what went on in these underground bone stores is based on what was discovered opening up this other one in Gozo. But this one here in Malta at Hal Saflieni has got this extraordinary rock cut architectural feature. So what this suggests really is at this point, the world of the underworld has in some sense collided with the overworld. The world of the temples is becoming metaphoric for this underworld, or maybe this underworld is metaphoric, who knows? But there's some sort of collision between the two worlds, the world of the dead and the world of the living, and the architecture of the dead and the architecture of the living have, at this point, fused in some way. Everyone now possibly is lost in metaphor. Now here's quite an interesting feature. We're looking into this chamber. In here is another chamber. And then in here is yet another chamber. So this is 3 chambers in. We're not looking smack into the center of this innermost chamber. We're slightly offset. There's some sort of maybe shelf arrangement here to the left. You can't see it. This is, I think, maybe this is a feature of quite a lot of the temples. The direct line of sight is averted. There's an aversion, there's a hiding, there's a slight displacement of the view. And that is rather like what we saw in Ajaim, where the moon could only just come clear of the southern building. Only at the very extreme point of the range was it allowed in. Otherwise, the southern building would have excluded it. So there are our 3 temples that we're looking at: Gigantia, Courtyard, small one, Ajaim, the huge one. This is the Hypogeum, which is the one, the underground one we were just looking at. And here's Zara, which is another one of these Hypogea, not so fully worked as Hal Saflieni, but in the case of Jara's circle, megaliths were brought down and put in. And so some temple structures of shells and apses and trilithons, and all the furniture of the surface temperature, all the furniture of the surface temple was imported in to the burial chambers underground. So again, we had this kind of collision of the world above and the world below. One of the major finds from the Jara mortuary complex was this figure here, thought to be 2 women. Not necessarily the case. This one on the left probably is a woman. She's got a little child here. There's a figure on the right, got a bowl, which is probably an ochre bowl. And then here we can see the red ochre staining of the feet, because the bones in Jara were sort of buried in earth, but there was a lot of ochre in there as well. They were buried in the red earth. Okay. That's that lot. Okay, now the theory I'm working on is that these 3 temples, at least, were aligned on the moon. But there is, as it were, another strand in this particular study, which was the strand that Serio, Hoskin, and Ventura kind of went for in 1992, although they did hedge their bets a bit. One of the great things about the Centaurus crux theory is that it's always a bit vague. Which one were you looking at? Which of these stars, was it Rigel Kent? Was it Hadar? Was it Gar Crux? And these have got slightly different points that they rise. So provided you don't plump for one, you're okay. You're not going to get caught. So I've done context. So now I'm just going to take a brief look at the star theory. Now, this is not my theory. As I say, it was the one put up by Serio, Hoskin, and Ventura. And then Torrey Lonsdalen has plumped for this one a couple of years ago very strongly. Okay, So this is a star theory. Now the orientation of the Earth with respect to the fixed stars is not stable. It's doing this little cycle over 26,000 years. So now we're looking about how were things 7,000 years ago? Okay, well, the axis of the Earth didn't point this way. The axis of the Earth sort of pointed that way, kind of thing. This is called precession. And the effect is that some stars were much higher in the sky and other stars were much lower. I mean, the constellations would have been much the same. Not we necessarily know that this group of people in Malta saw the same constellations that we do, but the groupings would have been, the mutual arrangements between the fixed stars is stable over this kind of period. But how they appear from Malta, our case here, was very different in, say, 3600 BC, which is the period we're looking at. So this is the March sky, midnight. That's the June sky, midnight. That's the September sky. This is a fairly kind of familiar kind of sky, except now we get it in the winter. But we've got Orion here, and we've got a bright star down here, Rigel, Pleiades. That's the September sky. And then December sky, there's a whole bunch of stars now which have moved well south. So this is Hadar. Rigel Kent hasn't risen yet. This is December midnight, and there's Garcrux. And there's this whole arrangement here. Now these particular maps, these are maps are produced on Richard Monkhouse's program, Starry 8. Many people nowadays use a different program called Stellarium, but I don't like Stellarium so much. I like this program, so this is the one I'm using. I'm using Richard's program. Now I put in all the stars. This is the autumn sky, and this is all the stars down to 6.5, which is magnitude 6.5, which is thought to be about the limit of human sight. And we can see there's quite a long, there's a line of stars running out here. Canis Major, Orion, Hyades, Pleiades, running up to Perseus. There's a bright band. And then this one is quite extraordinary. This is the midnight sky, midwinter. And you've got this great line of stars running along parallel to the ocean, looking south. Here's the Southern Cross here. There's Garcrux there. Here's Hadar. Rigel Kent hasn't risen yet. So this, essentially speaking, is the line of the Milky Way. Now, the Milky Way is a dark sky phenomenon. A dark adapted eye, cones, rods. Rods are what you see with under very low light conditions. And if you give them half an hour to maximize, then they're 10,000 plus times more sensitive than day vision. You've got to keep the light down, they get swamped. You lose that ability if you expose yourself to bright lights. But in the prehistoric period, there probably weren't any bright lights, so the Milky Way would have been much more visible. It won't have been this visible because this is what the camera sees. This is a view of the Milky Way taken by Mike Treadgold. It's taken actually in Auckland, New Zealand. But here we have Rigel Kent, Hadar, two bright stars of Centaurus. And let's just zoom in a little bit. There's Garcrux there. Here's a wonderful gas cloud, the coal sack. That's the head of the black llama. If you are doing Andean astronomy, and it might be the head of the, is it the emu in the Australian Milky Way version? Because most cultures from a time when there weren't artificial light distractors saw the Milky Way, perhaps not quite so amped up. We get it in long exposure photograph. Nevertheless, it was seen as maybe a god, maybe a goddess, maybe an animal, maybe as a river of light. And I think a river of light is quite interesting because where does it get refreshed? It gets refreshed when it drops into the ocean. So now we're just going to take a little tour down the Milky Way. Knock this one off. Where are we? Toxine, compare, processional. No, we're not going to take a little desktop. Excuse me for a moment. Ah, right. Found it. This is a nice paper by Ilario Cristofaro, 21. Now she's quite keen on the Centaurus crux hypothesis. And her point is that if you watch the Milky Way, and I've amped up the Milky Way a little bit on this map, I've cheated a bit. What I've done is I've taken faint B types, which tend to line up down the plane of the Milky Way because that's where they're made. They're made within the galactic arms. So I've amped up the Bs and they're going to stand in for the Milky Way. Okay, so that's the view from Malta in period. Let's just wind back a little bit. Here's the Southern Cross, there's Garcrux. And Ilario Cristofaro's theory is that Garcrux was of interest in the period because it's quite close to the pivot point. Here's the Milky Way, it's coming up out of the ocean, it's going back in again. And the Southern Cross is close to the central action. There it is setting. Here's the Southern Cross. Here's Hadar. Here's Rigel Kent. Okay, so that's one reason perhaps why the Milky Way was of great interest. So now we're looking at the star theory. Now, the star theory rather relies on the three temples having having very, very similar fields of view. And if they were aligned pretty much on azimuth 130, as this example is, then the theory is that Garcrux, Gamma Crucis, Garcrux, first becomes visible at the critical altitude, which is about 3 degrees. Below 3 degrees, you can't see it because the atmosphere just wipes it out. But at about 3 or 4 degrees, it's a bit tricky. 3 degrees, to my mind, is a bit low, but there are arguments in favor, there are arguments against. But suppose Garkrux became visible at 3 degrees above, and suppose these 3 temples all pointed towards the same azimuth at 130, then Garkrux, which might have been of interest, perhaps for the reason that Ilario Cristofaro put forward, because of its relation to the rest of the Milky Way, would have appeared, as it were, at about here, and this would have been sufficiently interesting to have aligned the temples on it. Now, a difficulty with this theory is that the 3 temples we're looking at don't have precisely the same frame. We've seen that this frame here is probably pretty good. Rising track declination 30, well, the moon is actually rising, the far southerly moonrise is rising very close to declination 30. It's rising at declination 29. So it's about this kind of path here. So we can see that that pretty much matches what we saw in yes, pretty much matches Argine. The rising point was well to the left. And so by the time it got up to sort of middle of the view, it was appearing pretty much in the middle of the temple. And that conforms to where Garkrux would have been seen in period. But the fact is that Gigantea, for example, is well to the left. Quite how much, difficult to say, but I'm supposing it's at least 2 degrees further left, maybe 2.5. So for Gigantea, this same theory that has Garkrux, aligned on Garkrux, to my mind, doesn't really work. And I think that Targerat also has a similar sort of frame. So I don't think it really works for Targerat either. In period, 3600, another star was rising smack in the middle, and that was Rigel, foot of Orion. Well, again, we're still just looking at Argime here, and here's Rigel rising in the middle of the field. So here's Rigel here, rising in the doorway. And if we've got an open courtyard, then we've got all these stars appearing overhead. In fact, we've got the Milky Ways lining up with the main axis of the temple. Put Garkrux in the doorway, this doesn't happen. Put Garkrux in the doorway, and the sky overhead is pretty empty. So this is an autumn. The first time you actually see Garkrux rising above the horizon is sometime around the autumn equinox, which by coincidence is the same time as the helical rising of Garkrux. But there we are. There's a lot of coincidences going on here. Now, I quite like this one. I'm kind of working up the star theory to see how it looks. So I couldn't resist trying to apply it to Takshin. This is Takshin temple. And Takshin temple is facing southwest rather than southeast. I tried to get Rigel Kent in the doorway. Well, I can get it in the doorway at about 10 degrees up, but I can't get it any more central than that. And down here is Garkrux. Takshin consists of 2 temples. This is the south temple looking out, and it's got a main doorway. But there's also a second temple, the central temple, so called, and we'll click to that now.
John, have we got another 5 minutes or so? Or
Yeah, I think that's right. I think I'm gonna finish
yeah.
in 15 minutes.
Oh, 15 is quite a
10
long.
minutes. Okay, so this is Tokshin.
Brilliant.
Tokshin was pretty much reconstructed at the front, but you can tell which bits were reconstructed. There's a lot of ambiguity. There's a lot of courtyard here. And we're quite interested in this temple here. That's the one that struck me. Okay. The trouble with this temple is it doesn't actually have a doorway. It looks into this temple. This is the South Temple. Just to show you some of the decorative stonework, it's really quite lovely. And here's there was this extraordinary figure, which is about maybe 2 meters high. You'd have lost the top. So this is a single figure. This is the temple we're interested in, this one here. It's got a big, let's go back a bit. This stone here, which is a replacement, got melted away by acid rain. This is the original, which was taken out into the museum in Valletta. So there's an oculus. That's to stop you going in. Well, we've gone in and we're looking out. And now we've got an artificial horizon here. And this is our viewpoint. Again, we're at the waist of the temple, center of the waist, looking out in this direction here. Now, I wasn't able to do a moon set because now we're looking southwest and we're looking at the moon set. But I was able to get a star photograph. So we've got a couple of stars in Capricornus here. We've got Jupiter here. We've got Venus. We've got a few other stars. And we can use this to line up a star map. We line up a star map. We get a setting path for an object at declination -29, which is the setting declination for the moon set in period, the far southerly moon set. So, hey, we had Tokshin, we got a double group. We got the southeast group giving us this backward sequence in the spring. And we've got this autumn group giving us this sequence, all the time getting younger, time reversed, down to dark moon at midwinter. As we can see, Garkrux doesn't line up for Tokshin Central, but the moon does. Okay, so that's pretty much complete, but we just got a final point here. So this is returning to Lionel's original point. Just look for the minor standstill. Now here at the major standstill, the moon is rising very far south. And here at the minor, it's inside the sun. The sunrise point is halfway between the two cycles. There's a maximum cycle and there's a minimum cycle. So for 9 years in the cycle, the moon is rising somewhere south of the sun point. And for the other 9 years, in the minor end of the cycle, it's rising inside at the sun point. Well, all of these temples, well, not all of them, but most of the south ones, have also got an offset line to the midwinter sunrise. This is Gigantesia. Now the capstone's gone, so the light is penetrating right to the back, but we can just see the shadow of the orthostat here. So if there had been a lintel over the top, the sunlight wouldn't have got any further in than this. The sunlight is stopped here. This is a midwinter sunrise. But you've got a position here, and you can tell they're measuring the midwinter sunrise. And at the temple next door, Gigantea North, you've also got a way of measuring the midwinter sunrise. It lights up this orthostat here, really does rather nicely. This is a very good, so this is a midwinter sunrise, is lighting up this offset. It's an offset orthostat. Here at Courtyard, this is a midwinter sunrise, and it's lighting up this apse here. It's offset. It doesn't get to the back of the temple, but it gets to this bit here, offset. So you've got a way of spotting the midwinter sunrise. And again, lastly, at Argym, this is a midwinter sunrise. This is the lintel shadowing it. It doesn't get to the back. It's offset. As the sun gets higher, so it comes down here, so it never actually penetrates. But you do have a way of spotting where the midwinter sunrise is. And because you've got a way of spotting where the midwinter sunrise is, you've got a way of spotting where the moon goes inside of the sun for the minor half of the cycle. So from each of these temples, you've got a line out to the maximum of the cycle, and you've got a line to the minimum end of the cycle. Now I spent a lot of time trying to work out, well, what utility was this moon observation in period? And the only one I can think of is that this was an incest taboo thing. If you were born at the major end of the cycle, you could go with somebody who was born at the minor end because they'd be 9 years older than you, or they'd be 9 years younger than you. So you'd always be safe if you were a major standstill native, and you could always go with somebody who was a minor standstill native, and it wouldn't be your mum, it wouldn't be your dad. There is a chance, of course, it might be your brother, it might be your sister, so maybe you could have a rule which says that you mustn't go with somebody who's also a minor standstill or a major standstill. So this is a way really of dividing the population to two halves and putting a remove of 9 years between them. And this is, I think, outside of the magical properties of an alignment on the moonrise and the fact that you're running time backwards, all that sort of thing, there's possibly an incest taboo utility within an early population. I don't know, that's just a speculation, but that's for Lionel. Thanks, Lionel, that's the best I can do. Okay, so in conclusion, I'm suggesting that three temples, well, certainly these two, Gigantea and Courtyard, are aligned on the moon. And I think Argym might be as well. It's a little bit off in the case of Argym, but I think it might be. Now there's another whole group here, as far as I'm concerned, well, maybe these were aligned on the southern group of stars, and certainly the southern group of stars, those stars would have been a much better fit for this group here. This group here are all early. These are all Gigantea phase, first phase temples. These ones down here are all later. These are all Courtyard phase. See, what happens in the middle is this, well, you've got two groupings really. So maybe the early phase temples were aligned here on the moon, and that was okay. Everyone then was happy enough to go off with different orientations. We've seen that within the group that we drew up from Zara, the twin goddess, assuming they were both goddesses, we've got a twin goddess thing. So there's no reason why you shouldn't have two stellar alignments, at least one stellar and one lunar. This is perfectly okay, I would have thought. I would have thought going for a single rules all type theory was a way of casting our own present day, monolithic present day where only one God kind of thing onto the prehistoric mind. And I don't see why we should do that. Okay, that's me finished. I hope that wasn't too confusing.
Thanks, John. Can we end the screen share? Fantastic.
There we go. I'm going to stop sharing.
Fantastic. Thanks, John. That took us through some amazingly complex astronomy and some extraordinary sights. Absolutely fascinating, because I've hardly known anything about this culture, and brilliant suggestions. Does anybody want to come up with some comments and response? We've got some experts here. Anybody like to come back on some of these ideas?
I'd like to hear from Frank Ventura.
Me too.
Frank was going to say something.
Frank, you there?
Oh,
No response at the
maybe,
moment.
maybe Frank's so annoyed with you that he's vanished.
Oh.
Anybody else? I mean, just to push on more questions. It has the sense that all these different temples offer so many kind of different aspects on the skies, the directions they're looking in, that you've got some sort of collective observatory community going on. I mean, that's what it immediately, the sense of it is, with these particular groups that you've picked on, focused exactly on these lunar standstill or potentially the Milky Way pivots.
Well, the three I focused on are in a sense the big early ones. Two of them are the two big early ones. Mm-hmm. I see these as being the mother temples at the beginning of the period.
Yep.
So I see that there was a lunar attachment at the beginning of the period. Yep. And subsequently it got shifted.
Yep.
And a second line came in.
Yep.
And this might have attended some sort of shift in the power arrangement anyway. You might have Malone, who is it? It's Stoddart and Malone, who were two archaeologists, quite well known, I think. They got very keen on the idea that a priesthood emerged within the Taksheen.
So some kind of appropriation.
Yeah, there's an appropriation process. Yeah, there's a lot of collectivization early on. We have collective burial. In fact, collective burial continues right through. So that suggests the origin is terrifically egalitarian. Everyone gets buried together. But then as you move into the Taksheen, the spaces become increasingly secretive.
Yes.
So there's some sort of process of appropriation, and there might have even been some sort of gender shift or some maybe there's, I mean, you've got 1,000 years to do it.
Yeah.
1,000 years is enough time
Mhm.
for this gender shift to come on.
It's fun that there wouldn't have been hunting. This would have been agriculture with pastoralist, a bit pretty
Well,
subsistence.
right the way through, yeah.
Yeah.
There've been various studies done on this, but I think the argument is that they moved into full-time agriculture very early on. The population gradually grew, so more temples got built in the Takshin as all the available agricultural land was taken.
Right.
By the end of the Takshin, that was it. It had reached, as it were, maximum population, which was something maybe it's
Okay.
between 10,000 and 20,000.
Right.
And most odds are it was about 12,000. That kind of point. You've got 30 temple complex, 30 temple sites
Mhm.
to
Mhm.
share between 12,000 people. I'm not quite sure how that works out, but
Okay.
that gives you some notion of local communities.
500 or 600 people or something. Yeah.
But the big complexes have got several temples in them.
Right.
So
So in that case of kind of land shortage, you might expect an emergence of something quite patrilineal in those circumstances. You'd think that could be associated with gender shift.
yeah,
Because you need to establish your land claims and hang on to it, and yeah.
all that sort of thing, yes. And this is another reason why the temples have slightly different orientations, because you don't want to have the same orientation as the temple next door to you.
No.
You want to be different.
Yeah.
So this gives you the scatter.
There could be all kinds of stories associated to ancestry represented in the sky of some sort of something.
All that sort of thing. So we're going to go for Rigel Kent. Hey, we're going to go for Regina. Hey, we're going to go for Garcrux, and so on.
Yep.
I think Tori has a question.
Right.
Am I right?
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, John. That was very interesting and very detailed what you presented there. Excuse me. And what you mentioned, what could have been the reasoning for its temple orientations? You keep to 3 temples, but there are other temples as well that has these alignments in them, which I discovered during my research, my PhD research, which I submitted last year. But the big question in all this is, why were they oriented the way they were? You mentioned obviously the Garcrux, the star, which could have been. They could have been the major lunar, the standstill, or as well the winter solstice sunrise, which has more temples than the 3 you mentioned, which have this offset illumination. And now I just want to obviously we will never know the exact answer in this, but and we have to be careful not to let our modern mind influence the way the prehistoric people thought or constructed things. But the thing is that if you think about the major lunar standstill, that happens every 18, 19 years. And you have the winter solstice sunrise happens every year. And you have also that the stars, the Garcrux, that happens also every year. It has its heliacal rising around the autumn equinox, and it disappears again around the spring equinox. So which you would see every day. So wouldn't it be more potential is that they would align temples to what they would see more often that was something that would happen only every 19 years.
Okay. The argument is that prehistoric societies were ruled by the moon. The moon determined when you could go out at night and when you couldn't. Simply that. So you follow the moon. The moon is the primary. The moon is the primary timekeeper. The moon gives you the middle of the winter. The moon gives you the spring. The moon gives you the summer. The southerly moonrise, the southerly full moon is midsummer. The northerly full moon is midwinter. So all those measures, the measures for the solar year, can be perfectly easily measured by taking notice of the moon. And you, in the prehistoric period, you took more notice of the moon because you didn't have artificial lighting. The moon was your main light source. And then there are other arguments for following the moon. And these are to do with the cycles of women, the menstrual cycle and so forth, which are also lunar aligned. So if you have a society in which women are strong, and you have a society in which timekeeping is regulated by the moon, then the moon gets to be primary, perhaps in a way that stars aren't. Stars are interesting if you're navigating a boat, but we can see that these temples were built in a period when there wasn't much navigation. There was a bit of navigation, as we know, but not much. There's hardly any exotic materials discovered on these islands in the temple period. These islands were pretty well cut off, just a little bit of trade, maybe, a little bit of obsidian, maybe a bit of ochre, although it's beginning to look as if ochre was produced locally as well to some large extent. Anyway, so that's my answer to that objection, is that the moon is primary and the business of time telling and looking at stars is really rather secondary. The other point, I think, was to do with the main alignment. We're trying to keep it simple. We're just looking at the main axial alignment of the temple. The moment you start looking at offset alignments, what happens if the light comes into the slant this way or to slant that way, then you've doubled and trebled the number of alignments you can look at. So in favor of keeping the argument simple, sticking just to the main axis.
No, of course, John, the moon was important. I don't, absolutely. But the first calendars, I mean, we know about Mesopotamia, they were moon-based. But later they changed it over to sun movements calendar, because the moon calendar is out of sync, because it's only so it turns the season out of sync, and that's why they turn into sun-based calendars.
Okay, come back on that one. You're quoting Mesopotamia. You could also probably quote Egypt. These are states. These are vast, huge societies, hierarchical societies with cities and rulers engaging in warfare with neighboring states. We're into modern, yeah, sure. Once you move into big states, then everyone switches into the sun because that's the arrangement. But when you're in small scale egalitarian societies, you don't move into the sun. You move into the sun once you want to get taxation. So Mesopotamia, yeah, tax the people, got to be solar.
Yes,
but we're in a pre-tax society here. We're in an egalitarian society, so we're still okay with the moon.
Yeah, but the problem with the moon and a calendar is that you have 13 lunar cycles in a solar year, and so that's why that comes out of sync eventually, and that's why I don't say.
Chris, did you want to say something, Chris?
I mean, just obviously the question there is out of sync with what? I mean, clearly the moon is out of sync with the sun in the sense that you can only get it. You can only get the months synchronizing with the year by having artificial months. And just some bishop, as obviously in Europe, ends up deciding that there's 31 days or 30 days or 28 days and all that stuff. But critical, surely, about the switch over from the moon to the sun is that you can organize a hunting expedition once a month and hopefully be able to, you know, catch the animals by full moon when it's safest to be out at night. But what you can't do is as soon as you get agriculture, you can't sow the seeds and then reap the harvest. You need a whole year, and so obviously the seasonal calendar, the solar calendar, begins to take priority. And of course, connected with that, as I think John's pointing out, you then begin to get, not immediately states, of course, but you certainly begin to get, you know, increasing intensification of patriarchal power at the expense of a system which is much more egalitarian and much more in tune with women's monthly cycles. So I mean, sure, the moon's out of sync, but why would that be a problem? I mean, it was originally not a problem, but it becomes a problem when, you know, when the seasonal calendar begins to take priority because you're into agriculture.
But I'd like to come back on the agriculture and the moon, because I know people here in Norfolk who do all their planting by the moon. And in Ibiza, for instance, there's a lunar calendar published every year, and that's what the farmers go on. So they're farmers, but they're still running it on a lunar calendar.
Right.
You can do that. You can do that, John, but there's no absolute, there's nothing obligatory about following the moon. I mean, I can understand why people like to follow the moon, but I mean, it's, you know, I'm not sure it's got quite the same coercive necessity as it,
listen,
you know.
that we're talking about something that's a transitional state, isn't it, between where John's identifying that there's still a very strong focus on the moon, on a large scale time cycle with these temples, clearly of great importance, before it shifts, and it's a background of subsistence agriculture, which isn't really to do with hunting. Next week we're going to hear from Bernie Taylor on the lunar timekeeping of the Upper Paleolithic, but it is an intersection of lunar calendar with a solar seasonal calendar because it's a northerly latitude Upper Paleolithic. So all of these cultures are working at how to reconcile the moon with the seasons, but there are many mechanisms for just letting slip that, you know, you can just slip through the winter months to bring up the spring moons and the observations that John was focused on, for instance, and we'll hear about it in respect of ethnographic calendars next week as well. So I think it's you know, we can't just say it's just hunting, just farming. There's a kind of transitional state between the two.
Can I just say that the little possibly bit of imaginative reconstruction that I most enjoyed from your talk, John, was the idea of receiving the moon as a guest, as a visitor. Of course, that immediately takes me back to this idea that so many hunter-gatherers have, which is that the moon is woman's other husband, and that while the moon's not visible in the sky, while it's dark, the moon has been welcomed by women as their other husband, and of course the sign of that visit from the moon is menstruation, and it's just lovely how you sort of picture the architecture of those temples as in support of that here is where the visitor arrives and is welcomed. It was really lovely touch.
There's some very nice stuff in the chat. Audrey, did you want to say anything about some of the background stories that associate? And also, Ivan, you had something there on the snakes. Might be worth saying something. I don't know if Audrey can speak. No? Ivan, do you want to talk about the snakes just a bit? Just mention it.
Yes, I can't remember in complete detail, but me and Brian Campbell were out there. We took some students on a field trip this year to Malta, and we actually managed to visit the Hypogeum as well. And when we're on tours of other archaeological sites, a Maltese man was telling us, Brian's Maltese as well, so he'd know the story, but I don't think he's here anymore, I'm not sure. Anyway, it was a kind of very much like a St. Patrick's story of someone clearing or getting rid of all the snakes from the island. And I mean, I've got a feeling there's quite a few stories like that across the world, but I interpret it as probably kind of an ending of female associations with serpents or something like that. I don't know. That's just my interpretation.
Mental solidarity, pretty
Yeah,
much.
exactly. Yeah. So, and I thought it was really interesting because, like you say, I think what's interesting here is with these kind of temple complexes, we shouldn't really think that they're probably some kind of egalitarian society. It's more likely that they're appropriating symbols from earlier egalitarian, gender egalitarian groups, you know. So take the moon, obviously, would be clearly a super important symbol, and it has to perhaps be invited into houses as a way of kind of preserving, maintaining that power, or what's the word I'm looking for, appropriating that power for a different kind of social organization. That's what I would assume in those places. And you know, when likewise with the underworld stuff, when I was in the Hypogeum, that's kind of what I was thinking of. This is a way of perhaps appropriating a different kind of symbolic order that was mapped onto a different social order into this new, more patriarchal order. But you know, I could be talking nonsense. I don't know.
Is the mortuary behavior also shifting from a collective treatment to something that's more individualistic, or do we have any idea about that?
I don't know. I think what we have to go on is the Zara excavation, which of course was in Gigantea. So it may be that Gozo was slightly more old-fashioned.
Right.
In Tarkgene, there might have been a distinction between the two islands and between those two groupings. I mean, all the stuff at Tarkgene is much later. It seems to me that the colonization, the initial colonization was Gozo.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Then it spread gradually into Malta.
Mm.
But the Tarkgene is the later period, and then it reaches saturation, and then we get to the point at which the whole thing dies out anyway, and we're not quite sure why. Sorry, I've lost the question.
Just if the mortuary practice shifted from collective to individual, because of course that is
Right.
is a characteristic of some of the Neolithic barrows in this country, isn't it?
Within the Zara circle, it seems to have been collective throughout. But this isn't necessarily true of the House Affliini
Sure.
mortuary complex, but we don't really quite know about the House Affliini because the excavation records, 1902, has all been lost.
Right, yeah. Oh, what sacrilege, what ridiculous. Just one other thing, we were talking with Martial here, yeah, on the idea of the incest taboo, and we would think in terms of those 9-year intervals marking the 9 years inside the sun, the 9 years outside the sun, in terms of age sets quite significantly. And of course you could work. Do you remember, Chris, about Wendy James?
I do.
Yeah, so the age sets could indeed work in terms of marriage prohibitions to well, you could marry adjacent age sets. You could never marry within age sets or double age sets. Yeah.
And it would mean you'd have a sort of collective and synchronized initiation rituals, which wouldn't be every year. They'd be much more widely separated in years and linked to these
the 9-year.
These 9-year cycles. Yeah,
would make it quite, that would fit patterns that are quite characteristic for pastoralists, potentially, if there was a
Yeah.
lot of.
Yeah. Just one more little point, which is just that an obvious connection between the moon and the stars, and a possible way of sort of reconciling different theories, is just that you can only see the stars really properly when the moon isn't in the sky. And of course, to see the maximum number of stars and to see the Milky Way brightest, you want the darkest, darkest, darkest and longest night you'll ever get. And of course, as Lionel Sims pointed out, if some shaman asks the engineers, can you build me something so that we can have the longest night and make sure that our ceremonies are happening then? I mean, that will be when the winter solstice exactly coincides with the dark moon. So I mean, and that would just give you, you couldn't ask for more stars visible in the sky. And given that hunter-gatherers, almost their motto, and we know that from the Hadza, but so many other groups, I mean, their motto is something like "Let there be darkness," because without the darkness, you can't see the stars, and you can't really communicate with them as some kind of ancestral spirits in some sense. Then we can see why darkness was so important, and why all these temples seem to be oriented in that direction. But anyway, I thought that was a really very, very, very brilliant presentation, John. Very, very interesting. And it's just interesting, isn't it, how closely your interpretations mirrors Lionel's interpretation of Stonehenge and Avebury Stone Circle, with the moon running through its phases, sort of reversing time. I mean, all those things, it's wonderful to see that what Lionel was finding isn't just confined to Wiltshire. It's so much more widespread.
We're probably going to have to wind up unless we've got some other. There was nice stuff in the chat, but if there's any other points quickly that anybody'd like to raise here, and that was a really great exploration, opening up all kinds of things there, John. It's helped me get some idea of some sort of grip on this extraordinary culture and these extraordinary archaeology. It's absolutely fascinating. And skyscape archaeology is without any question key in interpretation. So I'm just going to mention a couple of things for everybody here. On next week's talk, it has relevance for tonight, and it continues the theme, but it's taking us back to hunting cultures of the Upper Paleolithic with Bernie Taylor and his very extensive observations of rock art, cave rock art from the Upper Paleolithic as forms of lunar timekeeping calendars in the Upper Paleolithic. Absolutely fascinating stuff. And one other thing I was going to mention, because that is our last talk in this series, but we do have a very nice event on Saturday, June 24th. That's the first Saturday of the next new moon, in the Saturday afternoon, with Chris Knight and Morna Finnegan on language and laughter. So some people may be interested in that. That's going to be our last event before the summer. And please do, if you want to come along, it's 5 to 7 o'clock on that Saturday, June 24th. You can use the Zoom ID you used tonight. If you don't actually need to register, just come along. But otherwise, search for the event on Eventbrite. And otherwise, we've just got to say thanks to John. Thanks so much for that fantastic presentation. It was really appreciated, I think. Yeah, thank you very much, John.
Thank you, John.
Yeah, well done, John. Well done.
Great to have the record.